Hello, welcome to our video explaining the strategy to Bono's 6 thinking hats and how it can be used in everyday practice. This tool was created by Edward de Bono, and these thinking hats are simple to use in everyday teaching to promote thinking, both independently or within groups for students. So you could physically have the 6 colored hats in your room or just display them on the board, like on the next few slides, to promote thinking and discussion, depending on the activity. You don't need to use all of the hats every time you use it. This strategy is great for ethical or moral debates, analysing decisions, case studies, and problem solving. So we're going to look at the different hats and what they would mean within an activity. Okay, so to make it a bit clearer in terms of when we go through the hats, I'm going to use this example scenario. So this is something I've used the 6 thinking hats for. Was China's one-child policy a necessary evil or a human rights breach? So we're talking about the one-child policy in China, the lesson. We want to explore the aspects of this. This is obviously for older students, but it's just a scenario that we're going to use as we work through the 6 thinking hats and how you can use them. Okay, so first up would be our red hat. So this is always our emotional hat, and it's where we get the students to think about straight away their gut feelings and their hunches. And this hat ensures that we value our emotions, but not to let them dominate our thinking or dwell on them for too long. The emotional space can often be a default hat for students, and to be fair, for adults as well. So it's important to touch on it because it's important and it's valuable, but you have to move on. So questions to consider. What do you feel about the suggestion? What are your gut reactions? What intuitions do you have? So straight away, if we were looking at the example scenario that we're using, China's one-child policy, the straight away gut reaction will be, this is horrific, this is awful, this is so unfair, those poor children. The gut reaction is that it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. So, and then we move on from that and learn a bit more. Then you move on maybe to the white hat. So this is the information seeking hat. So this is the hat that looks for the facts, the data, the proof. This hat collects evidence, facts, data. This hat makes no judgments or opinions. So it's just collecting information. So questions to consider. What are the facts? What information is available? What is relevant? And so in this situation, the students would have to, if we look at the scenario of the one-child policy, they would be expected to look at the big picture, when it was set up, what was the impact of it, what was the problems in China before they introduced it, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so then we move on to the yellow hat. So this is the optimistic hat. So this is where we look at the advantages and we are forced to be optimistic, even if something, maybe perhaps we don't agree with it. So this hat is bright, positive, and has logical thinking. This hat is about being constructive, effective, and getting a job done. This hat is to use to consider the good aspects to something. So questions to consider very simply, what are the benefits or the advantages? So with the example of the one-child policy, the students are forced to look at the good aspects of that, and some of the good aspects of that would be that there's reduced population, that there's less people in China living in poverty, that they have improved medical care for women because of all the research they would have done around contraception and birth control and other forms of that. So there are some positives that you can take from the one child policy, looking at it as a case study, and the students will be forced to do that in this situation. Now we focus on the black hat. So this is the cautionary hat, and this is where we explore the downsides, the weak points, or the pessimism is coming out in us. So this hat will play devil's advocate. It focuses on logical and negative judgment on why something won't work and why it isn't good. So this hat can be used to critique your thinking, and it's a powerful hat to use. So questions to consider. What are the errors or pitfalls? What are the risks or dangers involved? what difficulties and problems can be identified. So with the likes of the example we're using in China, so students are, gathering their research, or they've done that already, and they're refocusing on it. And, some of the negatives are obviously the human rights violations, the forced abortions, the forced infanticide as well, the low ratio of women to men based on the favorability of boys, and which means now there's issues for men to find lifelong partners, and there's also issues then with violence against women in China, etc., etc. So the impacts, so it's the negative on why it has caused social problems in China, just as this particular example. So they'd be forced to just focus on the negative. So now we look at the green hat. So this is our creative hat, so with solutions and ideas. So it's a creative mode of thinking. So this hat is creative and is open to new ideas and brainstorming. In the green hat, we look to new ideas and solutions. This hat makes no judgments or opinions. So again, questions to consider. What are the ideas and alternative solutions? How could I adapt this to make it work for me? So looking at something like the one-child policy, the students would, have a brainstorm and think, what could they have done differently? What would they change about the one-child policy? Knowing why it was implemented in the first place, the huge population problems in China. What would they have done differently? And, the students can come up with all sorts of ideas. That are less harsh than the one-child policy in the first place. And finally is the blue hat. So you should always finish on the blue hat. In terms of the other hats, it's good to start with the red, finish on the blue, but the others you can mix it up. So the blue hat is the decision-making hat. So it's the analysis, the planning, and the reasoning. So this is the big picture hat. It's cool and controlled. It rules over the other hats, and it always sets the focus, and it calls for the use of the other hats. So you use this hat at the end to come to a final decision and conclusion. It lets us reflect on the thinking processes used. So questions to consider. What plan can we put in place? What is our conclusion? So for this particular scenario, it was the China's one-child policy a necessary evil or a human rights breach? So in this particular scenario, they'd have to put all that information that they've thought about together and come up with their final conclusion. Was it necessary evil, or was it just plain wrong?